Okay, let's get started. Our paper for today is Elliott et al. 1989. This is a classic in weightlifting biomechanics titled A Biomechanical Analysis of the Sticking Region in the Bench Press. So this one builds on our motivational review article from last time, which was on sticking regions in several big lifts, and this is a study on sticking regions in a specific big lift, the bench press. I said this is considered a classic in weightlifting biomechanics, not just because it's kind of old now at this point, but it was a classic for a couple reasons. One, I don't know if it was necessarily the first to do this, but it was certainly one of the first studies to study really strong people, really strong bench pressers, and the biomechanics of their really strong bench presses. If you look down here in the subjects, it says they had 10 male elite bench pressers, and what made them elite exactly. These athletes had 1 rep max bench presses, all of them well north of 300 pounds, and the strongest in excess of 500 pounds. And so these were very strong bench pressers that they were studying here. It was a study that took place in Australia, so I'm guessing it was mostly Australian participants, but they said all 10 of the participants were at least state champions. 3 were national level record holders. 1 was a record holder for the whole Commonwealth, and 1 who was even a former world record holder. So that's some very, very strong participants that they studied here. And that was kind of how sport biomechanics was trending back in the 80s and early 90s when it was first kind of developing as a formal subdiscipline of biomechanics. Lots of studies examining what elite athletes do mechanically and what we can learn about successful performance, maybe even at the sub-elite level from examining how really good, really successful people do these particular movements, in this case, the bench press. The other element of the study that makes it a classic, again, I'm not sure if it was necessarily the first, but it is the first, at least that I know of, that studied the three-dimensional biomechanics of the bench press exercise. Previous studies had been limited to two-dimensional analyses looking at, say, just the sagittal plane or just the transverse plane, and the bench press is very much a three-dimensional effort, a three-dimensional movement, and so capturing that three-dimensional nature here for perhaps the first time in a biomechanics study. So what were they trying to do here? This is like the 5th time I've tried to record this video. I keep making mistakes and keep thinking I forgot something or I want to do it a little bit differently. So I took some notes here this time so that I don't forget. This was a descriptive study, like I said, with strong participants, the first three-dimensional analysis. They measured the three-dimensional motion of the arms and of the chest when the athletes were doing these movements. To do that, you have to be in a motion capture lab, and so that's where they did this. But they, to the best that they could, tried to replicate kind of the environment of like a powerlifting meet in the lab while they were doing this. And so they had them wear like their singlet that they would do like a competition in, had them have their training partner be their spotter and trade off lifts back and forth, and had verbal encouragement from the non-lifting audience. And so tried as best as they could to replicate like a competition setting in the laboratory setting. Measured the three-dimensional motion of the body using a motion capture system, and also measured from EMG sensors the activity of all the main muscles involved in the bench press. They mentioned in the methods that they also did some max isometric contractions after the bench press. Those are reference contractions that help with interpreting the EMG data. EMG, if you just stick like a raw sensor on somebody's muscle and measure the muscle activity, comes out in units of volts. And the volts can be very different from person to person. So like 1 volt on me doesn't necessarily equate to 1 volt on you. And so they use those reference max isometric contractions to scale the volts that they measure for each person to give it kind of a reference. And so rather than, instead of looking at your muscle activity in terms of how many volts, you can look at it in terms of where was it in reference to your specific max isometric muscle activity. So it's just kind of a helpful way for interpreting those measurements of muscle activity. So what were they trying to do here exactly? It was a descriptive study, so they didn't have any specific scientific hypotheses, like I said earlier, but they were interested in what's known as the sticking region in the bench press, where in particular for heavy bench presses, you lower the bar to your chest, and then you tend to accelerate it off your chest a little bit, and then you tend to slow down and get stuck for a little bit. And then if you're strong enough to get through that, then you get through kind of this max strength region, and then to finish it, you lock it out there. Okay? So they were interested in this sticking region in the bench press and what's causing that sticking region. And if I fail in the bench press, if it's too heavy of a weight, why do I fail? And do I actually fail in that sticking region or in some other region? And so that's what they were looking at here. In terms of the methods, they had the athletes in their lab doing bench presses like you see down here. And they did bench presses at several different weights. They first had them come in, and on that day just asked them, okay, what do you think is your 100% max for today? What's the most you think you could do? And then they would have them try 80% of that max, which, just to give you kind of a reference of how heavy that is, most people could probably do 80% of their 1 rep max about 8 times or so, which is a pretty typical rep range for strength training and bodybuilding and things like that. So about a weight that you would equate to maybe being able to do it 8 times or so. They're 80%. So they tried 80%. They then tried 100% of that estimated max. And if they were able to actually do that 100%, which I think most or all of them were able to do in the study, then they tried to go a little bit heavier. Then they tried to do like 104, 105% of that max. And most of them failed in that, and that was intentional. That was the design of the study here. They wanted to measure biomechanics and muscle activity during a heavy failed attempt of the bench press. That can be dangerous, of course. If you fail on a deadlift, you'll probably drop the weight, but you're probably not going to hurt anybody. If you fail on a squat, you can injure yourself pretty severely, but you're probably not going to die most of the time. Failing on a bench press can not only be injurious, it can be fatal if it's a heavy weight and if you don't know what you're doing and if you don't have spotters that know what you're doing. So that can be pretty dangerous to fail in the bench press. So this is probably a difficult study, I'm imagining, to get through human ethics at the university, but it was still very interesting data if you can get those data for biomechanics of actual failed attempts in efforts like this. It's very, very unique, very interesting data. So comparing the biomechanics between the submaximal lift, the maximal lift, and then the failed attempt at the super maximal lift there, trying to tease out when is the sticking region happening, why is it happening, and when I fail, like, why do I fail, and what, am I failing in that sticking region exactly? So what did they find here? The most interesting thing that I found in this study was in comparing figure 2 here to figure 3 here. That's comparing the measured pattern of force on the bar on the y-axis as a function of time on the x-axis during the lift. The 100% effort here in figure 2 and the 80% effort here in figure 1. And in each of these figures, this is just like representative data from a single person, but they make some comments in the text of the paper that basically all of the participants showed those patterns there, where you see a very different pattern of force applied to the bar during the 80% submaximal lift compared to the 100% maximal lift here. In the 100% lift, they saw these 4 distinct phases: this acceleration phase, followed by this sticking region, followed by this maximum strength phase, followed by this decelerating phase. And what are those exactly? So time 0 here starts after, let me make my video a little bit bigger here so that you can see this. Time 0 here starts after they've unracked the bar and lowered it to their chest, and then time 0 starts. And then it proceeds for the first 0.4 seconds or so through this acceleration phase where I'm applying force to the bar in excess of the weight on the bar to accelerate it upward. Then I tend to get stuck for a little while, right? I get stuck and I'm just barely applying enough force on the bar to hold it there, and maybe it even goes down a little bit. But then I get over that and I'm able to start accelerating it upward again here. That's that maximum strength phase. And then I get it through that maximum strength phase, and now I want to lock it out and bring the bar to rest. Okay? And that involves this last phase here, this deceleration phase, where I'm decelerating the bar. And that may seem kind of strange in a bench press. Towards the end when you're locking it out, you're actually applying considerably less force on the bar than the actual weight on the bar. But mechanically, that's an inevitability. That's required. If I'm going to be accelerating it upward, then I've got to apply more force than the weight. And if I'm then going to arrest that motion and decelerate it and slow it down, then I have to apply less force than the actual weight of the thing. So that may seem a little counterintuitive, but mechanically that's inevitably what has to happen. But in the 1 rep, max heavy, the successful heavy attempt there, saw those 4 clear phases in basically everybody. The acceleration phase, sticking region where I can no longer accelerate it upward, maximum strength region where now I'm able to keep continuing that upward motion, and then deceleration phase where I arrest that motion. In the 80% attempt, they saw a very different pattern where they basically just saw 2 phases, this acceleration phase and then this deceleration phase. There's no sticking region, there's no max strength region. I just accelerate it upward, then I start decelerating it downward and bring it to a stop. I felt kind of vindicated when I saw this because I don't know about you, but when I see this for all exercise. I notice it most often in like squats when I'm doing squats, but in bench press too, and in basically every heavy lift that I do. You start maybe doing 10 or 12 reps, 10 reps, 8 reps. You start adding weight, get down to, 6 reps, 5 reps, 4 reps. You get above a certain weight, and it feels like it just kind of suddenly shifts to mechanically, it just feels like I'm doing it totally different, right? Like it gets to above a certain weight or it gets heavy enough that now it's like my form just completely changes and I'm no longer even close to like the form that I was doing on like the 8 rep set or 6 rep set or whatever. I always kind of feel like that, like it gets to a certain weight and it feels like I'm just doing it totally different. And so I felt kind of vindicated to see these like world-class bench pressers here also demonstrating that, where the technique and the pattern of force application that they use, for the lighter, 8 rep weight is considerably different and rather dramatically different, I would say, compared to what they did here on the 1 rep max on the heavy set here. So very different set of mechanics involved in a 1 rep max lift compared to an 80% lift that you could probably do 5 to 10 times or so. So more germane to their actual research question is when I do too much, when I try this 104, 105% max lift and I fail that, where do I fail? You might kind of think, well, you probably fail in this sticking region. Interestingly, that is not where the great majority of the lifters failed. Most of them actually failed on the lift in this deceleration phase. So even on the, this, and again, this is just an example data from one person, but they chose this as representative of what most of them looked like, at least qualitatively, for most of these failed attempts, in that they got actually through the sticking region and actually well past the sticking region, then they failed in the deceleration phase, or in powerlifting, what we typically call the lockout phase of the bench press. They failed in the final phase there, which is kind of counterintuitive. That's not where we might intuitively think that you're going to fail on a heavy bench press most of the time. So why is that? What's causing that sticking region? And maybe the sticking region now actually becomes maybe a little bit less interesting since it's not where failures are happening. But what is causing that sticking region? Why on like a 80% lift am I just able to cleanly pump it out there? But on the 1 rep max, I start accelerating and I get stuck and then I get through that. What's causing that sticking region in the heavy lift? It's unclear. They don't have a clear answer for that from these data. They do rule out a couple things. They say it doesn't appear to be caused by the moment arm from the weight on the barbell to the shoulders and elbows increasing too much during that region. Remember, we talked about that last time, where the element of form and technique in weight training is in lining up your limbs and your prime movers, your joints that are spanned by your muscles involved in those lifts, lining it up and setting it up in a way that the amount of torque that gravity produces about your joints from the weight is minimized or is kept as small as possible, which is achieved by minimizing the distance from that weight to the center of those joints, in this case the shoulder joints and the elbow joints. And so they didn't see any evidence in their data here that during that sticking region, the moment arms from the weight that you're lifting to the shoulders and to the elbows were like suddenly dramatically increasing. And so I'm suddenly having much more gravitational torque that I have to overcome, and maybe I just barely have enough muscle strength to get through that. They weren't seeing any clear evidence in support of that idea. They also saw that if you looked at the activity of the muscles from the EMG sensors, that you basically maxed out the activity of your pectoral muscles and your front deltoid muscles when you lowered the bar to the chest, and then basically maintained that all through the entire lift, including that sticking region. And so the sticking region didn't seem to be caused by insufficient or submaximal activation of the muscles during that supermaximal attempt at the lift. And so they kind of rule out two maybe intuitively promising candidates there, and they didn't really have any data to speak more confidently on like any more distinctive ideas on what's actually causing that sticking region. The theory that they propose here, which I think makes a lot of sense, but again they don't have any data actually directly supporting it. It's just an idea that they had, is that that sticking region is a transition from elastic force to active contractile force. And what do we mean by that exactly? Let me make my screen a little bit bigger here. So elastic force is like, think of it like a rubber band, right? Think of this fitness band here as being a muscle. It's not a muscle, of course, but let's think of it like a muscle. As I stretch it, that creates some force inside this muscle here, right? And it's not like active contractile force from like the cross bridge is activating. Of course, a muscle will have force from that too. It's just force generated by purely elastic stretching of those materials, right? And so when you're at the bottom of the bench press like this, where where the weight is on my chest here, and I'm accelerating it off my chest, and I'm entering that sticking region, that's when my chest muscles are stretched to their longest length, and where my front deltoid muscles there are stretched to their longest length. And so at that time, at least this is the theory here, at that time, they probably have a large amount of force that's being expressed on the tendon due simply to elastic deformation of those muscles. Yes, there's some force from activation of the contractile machinery in those muscles as well, but there's going to be certainly at that point, that's where the largest amount of force from the just simple elastic stretch of the muscles is going to be too. This is also how like bench press shirts work. They're these really like thick pieces of elastic basically that you stretch across the chest, and then you get the bar down here, and the extra force from that stretch in that bench press cert helps you kind of get through that initial acceleration phase and that sticking region there. So a theory there that I think makes pretty good sense on what's happening in that sticking region is as I then lift the bar off my chest there, then that's shortening the pectoral muscles and shortening the deltoid muscles, relaxing that elastic force that was stored or that was generated in them during that large stretch. And then now I got to keep producing force, but it's got to be, it can't be from my elastic stretch. It's got to be from the active contractile force produced by cross bridge cycling. Okay, so that transition there from I'm getting a lot from the elastic stretch to oh no I'm not getting much or not getting a lot from the elastic stretch might be where that sticking region is happening there. But again, the importance of this sticking region may seem kind of lessened now, or perhaps unimportant, because we saw that the failures and the too heavy lifts actually didn't happen during that sticking region. They happened during the deceleration phase or during the lockout phase. So where do failures happen? Do they actually happen in the sticking region? No, they happened at least for these athletes, most of them in the deceleration region. So why did they fail on those lifts? What they saw here was that from the time of max acceleration, so from you first start getting the bar off your chest and really put that big acceleration on it, from that time up through the lockout portion of the lift, which is where they failed on these too heavy ones, they saw a very large increase in the moment arm from the weight itself to the center of the elbow joint. Okay, so a large flexor torque produced from the weight on the barbell about the elbow joint. Okay? And when you get a flexor torque due to gravity at your elbow in a bench press, that's bad, right? That's going to flex your elbows, which is lowering the bar and moving it in the opposite direction of what you want. To counteract that, you've got to fire up your triceps to produce an extensor torque and fight against gravity there and move the weight upward there. So during the failed lifts, then they saw a large increase in that moment arm for gravity producing a flexor torque at the elbow from that period of max acceleration up to that failure point, suggesting that failure here may be happening because it was asking too much from the triceps. It was requiring too much effort from the triceps. And this is something you'll hear a lot in powerlifting circles, like if you're unable to like lock the weight out there, you always want a little more chest strength, a little more shoulder strength, but lockout in particular is going to involve the triceps muscles quite a bit. So it could be insufficient strength or insufficient power in the triceps muscles specifically that was leading to failures in at least this case. I would hesitate to remember these were like world class, at least national class lifters here that were participating in this. Maybe not the most generalizable to like your everyday athlete or everyday gym rat. So don't know if we want to necessarily extend how they failed in the lifts to how your average person would fail in the lifts. But some evidence here that failure in the bench press was not happening during that characteristic sticking region, and was not happening from what we consider typically like the prime muscles targeted by the bench press, the chest and the shoulder muscles. It actually appeared to be the elbow muscles that were possibly the culprit or the problem there for the failure. Okay, let's tie this back to some conclusions on training. Remember, we talked about last time how there's kind of two key metrics for training that are important for muscle level adaptations in athletes from strength training. There's the intensity of the lift, which is typically indexed by the amount of weight that you're lifting, the pounds on the bar. And there's the volume of the lift, which is you do, a certain weight for a certain number of sets times a certain number of reps and multiply that all together, and that's your volume. So to progress those things, you can progress the number of reps you're doing, you can progress the weight that you're doing, but as you get heavier and heavier there, you're probably going to be changing your technique a little bit, as we see here in comparison, the 80% case to the 100% case. And you're probably going to be at risk of failure at the heavier weights as you go heavier and heavier there. And if you get in trouble, if you get stuck, it may not necessarily be because you're getting stuck in this, difficult like sticking point. It could be because of the triceps. It could be the triceps that are the problem there, and that you need to focus on to progress there and to keep progressing the training load. Okay, that is it for today.